Absolute knowledge in history. At the simple empirical level of consciousness that strives to become aware of itself and its situation, history is indeed the medium in which each of its figures necessarily unfolds. But if we consider experience in the development of its totality, then history reveals itself as one of the moments that constitutes this totality, in the intuition of the concept and its being there. History is therefore only a form of totality of experience, a first form, which we saw at the end of the previous chapter, that it could not fail to refer to another form of totality, which is nothing other than the totality of history and its meaning. But there can be no meaning that does not refer to the consciousness for which it is meaning, and this totality must then arise as that of a consciousness for which the totality of its experience is immediately significant. Thus, a new character appears above history, a third actor whose sole role is to be the one for whom all the rest takes on meaning. This actor to whom history refers us is the philosopher, insofar as they think the totality of experience and its meaning. The destiny of history is therefore to summarize itself, and thereby to deny itself in the single consciousness, although in empirical development it has appeared as the universal medium of this consciousness. Thus, at the very level of the philosopher's reflection, there arises as an explicit problem the question of what status to give to the philosopher in the universe of reflection that philosophy constitutes. This problem is not only a question of fact concerning the empirical or historical characteristics that make it possible for a man to think about experience or history, but it cannot be, as in Plato, divine favor, but rather it is a question of law at the level of a coherence of the system. Any system, once constituted in its entirety, once it is closed in its conclusions, leaves open the question of how and why this philosopher was able to think this truth that they present as total and unique. What status does this philosopher who has constructed a universe of truth give themselves? For Hegel, the problem is even more urgent, since it is within the system itself that it arises, since the thinker constitutes the last stone of the edifice, without which it would never be completed. Therefore, Hegel will pose the problem of his relationship with the whole of his system, not by remaining outside and as if detached from the system, like Parmenides or Leibniz, but by integrating himself into it. A paradox, perhaps, but one which is not as fruitless as the aporia in which one finds oneself when one seeks to situate Parmenides in the ontological sphere where, for him, thought and being are one and the same thing, or when one tries to place Leibniz somewhere in his universe. If it is true, as we have tried to show, that all the questions that are posed to the Hegelian system are transformed and summarized in one another to finally end up in this ultimate problem that contains them, we must take great care to understand in what terms it is posed for Hegel, in order not to fall into the too immediate and facile objections that deprive the system of all its meaning. Hegel has been criticized for saying that the consciousness to which history as a totality refers us is a true divine consciousness, a reflection of the world external to the world, the absolute knowledge of all that is relative. The philosopher, Hegel writing in the Phenomenology of Spirit, would be God himself, God reconciling himself with himself and with the world, God resurrecting after his long passion through the history of the world. To the words that God is dead, the existence of Hegel would be the most superb of replies. And at the same time, it is objected against Hegel that he stopped history at the same time as he was writing, that he believed he saw, in the new figure of the world which was to appear in the aftermath of the Battle of Jena, the eternal figure of the human universe. In fact, these two objections that are presented together have the primary defect of not coinciding, of even being contradictory. If Hegel, in thinking about history, adopts a divine perspective, then the future must be as present to him from the outset as the past, and it is not as a stopping of history that Hegel achieves, but the assumption of all past and future temporal development in the intuition of an eternal present. Thus, either Hegel makes himself God and he has not stopped history, or he stops history, but it is then through inability to make himself God and through incapacity to grasp, like God, at one go, the infinity of centuries. But not only is this double objection contradictory in its alternation, but also it clashes with the very letter of the Hegelian text, since it is shown in the philosophy of history that it is impossible for consciousness to transgress the historical moment in which it realizes its future. The error doubtless comes from the fact that we believe we see in this consciousness to which history refers a consciousness of the empirical type, a prophet's consciousness. One of those consciousnesses of which Hegel said in the Jena period that they can rise alone to the mastery of a greater length of the chain, that of history, if they recognize what is the direction of the great necessity, and if this knowledge teaches them to pronounce the magic word which arouses its form. In fact, in the phenomenology of spirit, the consciousness for which the totality takes on meaning, it is not made on the superhuman, empirically meta-empirical model, but rather it discovers itself outside all determination, of all empirical situation, of all proper content, as a perpetual center of reference. Totality would be a pole in the development of experience which would never become an element, an integral part of this experience. This referential point is what Hegel, throughout the phenomenology of spirit, calls nous. It is never found present as a certain content of experience, but always as a dimension of each experience, a dimension which always escapes empirical consciousness, and escapes so much so that the nous itself is never present, but only one side of the experience appears as escaping consciousness. It is only for us. It is this nous, this dimension of history for us, that forced us to recognize in the previous chapter that history could neither contain nor realize the totality of experience. Having given its true meaning to this beyond history, it is still necessary to seek its relationship with the rest of history. It is not true, as has been believed, that the beyond of history is immediately contradictory with itself. At least it is not yet certain that it is not in contradiction with the whole system. Difficulties have a great chance of arising, multiplied by the ambivalence of this dimension for we from experience. Indeed, it will be necessary to consider first what are the relationships of this dimension with other dimensions of experience, how the same experience can have alongside the meaning it takes on for the consciousness which realizes it, a meaning in itself and a meaning for us. But these relations of the for itself, the in itself, the for us, they constitute only one side of the question and fall apart into the problem of knowing what is the relationship of this new subject, the we, the other subjects which have already been identified, that is to say, empirical consciousness, and the transcendental subject of which we have given the expression in absolute knowledge. This is why we are going to have to answer two questions successively. What is the for us in relation to the it in itself and the for itself? What is the we in relation to consciousness, which is the subject of an experience? One of the factors in the development of experience has been the perpetual inadequacy of the in itself and the for itself, of what an experience was for the consciousness and what it was in its truth and in its essence. It is in this non-coincidence that lies with the true nature of consciousness, its misfortune and its pathos. It is not up to consciousness to possess in itself the truth of what it is, and its destiny constantly brings forth, in spite of itself, against its intention and its will, what it has always really been. Thus, Jesus had come to earth to reconcile his people with God and thus to conclude a new alliance. But it was the destiny of Jesus to convert to God all other men except his people. This historical experience in which the in itself makes fun of the for itself, the in itself turns it against itself, consciousness constantly realizes when for itself it grasps beyond, it is the very content of an experience that in itself it is content to attain. When refusing for itself all destiny, it shuts itself up in the beauty of its solitude in itself. It is a new form, even more unhappy, of destiny that it has chosen. This in itself, in which it finds the pain of its destiny, arouses in consciousness a new experience for itself, which is no more adequate to the in itself of which it becomes conscious than the latter was adequate to the consciousness of which it was the truth. If it is true that the in itself of the Stoic consciousness is to be sought in the worst indifference, then this indifference, when it becomes indifference for itself, will give rise to a new figure, that of the skeptical consciousness. Thus, phenomenological development will be made of this perpetual surpassings, of this incessant play between the for itself and the in itself. The truth of each, it is found neither entirely in itself nor entirely in the other. Their truth, which is also their destiny, is always to be separated. But this separation is not that of an absolute opposition, nor even of two irreducible moments, since a rigorous distinction without possible rapprochement would lead to an idealism where the in itself could never achieve an existence for consciousness, where the latter could not promote itself to the effective existence of the in itself. In fact, in the in itself communicates immediately with the for itself, since it is impossible to find anywhere but in the in itself, in the essence and truth of an experience, the reason for its appearance to itself. It is in its essence and in its history, Wesen was gewesen ist, that Jewish consciousness finds the justification for the extreme separation into which it is thrown, appearing to itself through the wrath of the jealous God. How the spirit of the world determines its object at each degree, or how it itself for itself depends either on what has already become or on what is it is in itself. But here too we must not fall into the opposite excess of the previous one, which would assimilate the in itself and for itself as the two sides of a single truth. It is then that a form of idealism would arise, in which what is in itself would be only insofar as it is for consciousness, and what is for consciousness would also be what is in itself. So that the subtle relationships between the for itself and the in itself is played out the fate of all Hegelian philosophy. It is constantly tempted by two opposing excesses, each of which would forever prevent us from finding the real in the happy effectiveness of action, or on the contrary, whether we mix them in the same reality. In both cases, we lose the benefit of the whole concrete description of consciousness. Only the most abstract ideal of idealisms remains. By maintaining the continuity of play of the for itself and the in itself in the tricks of their development, Hegel has escaped these two idealisms, which at bottom are only one. But what can this play mean? How can there be a surpassing of the for itself by the in itself, and by the in itself by the for itself? How does this not itself fall into the for itself or into the in itself? If this reversible passage from the for itself to the in itself belonged to that which for consciousness manifests itself, then it would be in itself a false passage. The in itself would be nothing other than another form of what is immediately known by consciousness as existing for itself. The true in itself would dissipate. But conversely, if this dialectic were a reality in itself and were only that, then how could it become for a consciousness the object of its knowledge? How could it come to consciousness and the fate itself as not being for itself, but rather as an effectiveness in itself? It, it is therefore that we must seek the passage of this in itself to the for itself, neither on the side of experience or consciousness, nor on the side of reality, but rather in a form of existence. An existence which will be neither an existence for an empirical and over disappearing consciousness, nor an existence without a relationship of meaning with a consciousness either. Because this consciousness, for which this relationship must exist, this consciousness without which the truth and the in itself of knowledge would be either illusory or unknowable, is what Hegel calls nous, the consciousness of the philosopher. The truth of the development of consciousness, such as the object of philosophical knowledge, such as our object, and it therefore exists. But for us, the in itself is this truth. It is not conceivable as such. If it sought to realize itself in this mode of existence, the truth would reveal itself as error. The truth of truth is to exist, not in itself, but for us. What does this being for us consist of, which is the mode in which the reciprocity of the in itself and the for itself exists? Being for us appears from the outset as a mode of anticipated existence, such as can be found in certain types of knowledge. It shows itself as a knowledge which surpasses immediate experience and knows in advance the destiny to come. Thus, self-consciousness, which through desire recognizes itself in its object, and takes as the object of its desire the self-consciousness as it exists in the other, this consciousness, it does not experience the spirit, but the concept of the spirit is present already for us. We already know that the self-consciousness will be transformed into this absolute substance, which, in the perfect freedom and independence of its opposition, constitutes the unity of the diverse self-consciousnesses. Being for us constitutes for a figure of consciousness the fact of being known in advance in its truth and in its destiny. But what can be the truth of such an anticipation, and in the name of what can one say that it is not only illusion or probability? And admitting that it is not only that, is it anything other than one of these principles of experience to which the transcendental idealism of Kant gave an objective status? This anticipation, which knows what is the future destiny of its current object. If it wants to be founded in truth, then it must be knowledge of what consciousness has not yet experienced. That is to say, it must have had the experiences that the empirical consciousnesses in relation to which they anticipate have not been reached. We can therefore know the truth of what for empirical consciousness is still only an appearance. Being for us cannot arise outside of being in itself and being for itself, unless we have already had the totality of experiences in the long path of which the empirical consciousness that we are currently studying follows. There can be being for us only because there is an experience already traversed from start to finish. Presented in this way, being for us would never be anything but a complicity of the philosopher with the universe of the reflection and the objects that they think. It would only be the absolutely inessential side which shows that the thinker already knows that the object of their thought will become as they let it develop. Thus, in these conditions, being for us, it would play no determining role in the phenomenological investigation. It would only translate the indiscrete presence of the philosopher. In reality, the dimension by which being for us appears is quite another thing. Without a doubt, the being for us has the destiny to disappear constantly, but also to be perpetually joined by the in itself and by the for itself. That the in itself joins the being for us is what immediately appears as necessary, since the in itself is nothing other than this truth that we only anticipate. Since we know that in the work of the slave, work experienced as the worst of separations of the for itself and the in itself, the unity of this is in itself and this for itself will be realized. Indeed, it is in oneself that this unity is realized, and in oneself, in the effective reality of things, that the slave becomes the master of the master, well before this effectiveness exists for consciousness. The being for us immediately precedes the being in itself. It is like its heralding sign, so that Hegel can assimilate them and frequently say, in itself or for us. All that will remain for consciousness is to transform this from being in itself into experience for itself, so that being for us no longer does anything but the same thing with what seemed the most distant from it and with what was perfectly foreign to it. Thus, in the play of forces, what was once only for us reveals itself when this play has been transformed in the movement of recognition of consciousness as an experience for each of the consciousnesses. Now, this incessant disappearance of being for us, which always dissipates before the reality of being in itself, is not the sign of its phenomenological uselessness and inefficiency, but, on the contrary, the sign of its extreme activity, which is that of mediation. If it is always called to disappear, then it is not because it is only an epiphenomenon in phenomenology, but because, on the contrary, it has taken upon itself the work, the patience, and the seriousness of the negative. Our knowledge is not only the knowledge of what the in itself will be when it is realized, but also a mediating form, a term by which the in itself can become fully effective. If the in itself did not pass through this moment of being for us, it would always lack the ability to be for a consciousness. It would be, but would never be an experience. It would be outside of all consciousness, which, from the phenomenological point of view, would amount to saying that it is not. If it were not preceded by this moment of the for us, which allows it to be accessible to an experience, the in itself would fall into this abstraction, which is the worst of unrealities. If the rule of law and the validity of the person had only been in itself of Stoicism, then a consciousness would never have been able to experience them. They would never have been able to be promoted to the effectiveness of the world. Because there was this experience of the in itself and of being for us, what Stoicism was the in itself, only an abstraction, is now the effective world. The dimension by which experience escapes itself and its reality, and has only truth for us, this new dimension allows experience to find outside itself something that will be its truth, and which will remain this truth through all transformations. Being for us is therefore what prevents the total discontinuity of the in itself and the for itself, and what saves the continuity of movement of becoming, where there is a risk of irreducible novelties arising. The for us is, therefore, one of the principles of dialectical ability. What is born is only an object. For us, it is at the same time as movement and as becoming. If this is indeed the mediating role of existence for us, it remains to be seen by virtue of what is this side of experience that plays this role, and what place it occupies in the constitution of phenomenology. At the end of the development of consciousness, being for us, it no longer appears in its autonomous and mediating role, but it disappears entirely in favor of being in itself and being for itself. But this disappearance means not th- that it no longer occupies a place in the moment of absolute knowledge, but on the contrary, that the place which has fallen to it is the essential one. The moment by which the in itself can become for itself, and the for itself in itself, being for us, finds in the unity of this in itself and this for itself the moment of the full and entire effectiveness. Its activity as a negative movement of mediation has found its end in the success of its realization, so that far from disappearing in absolute knowledge, it is they who realize themselves perfectly there, and who constitute the essential of this self, where the in itself and for itself find their destiny. At the moment of absolute knowledge, what in the first instance happened in oneself is at the same time for consciousness is itself doubled. It is for consciousness, and it is for and it's being for itself or its own operation. This operation is the immediate mediation realized by the being for us, which has succeeded in making the being in itself immanent to the being for itself. The reality, the fullness of the being for us, is therefore to be found in absolute knowledge, where we wanted to see the transcendental subject. When we meet in the course of the phenomenology of spirit, being for us and its mediating role of negativity, we do nothing other than show transcendental activity in its constitutional function. The side by which experience escapes towards us is also the one by which it is constituted by virtue of the transcendental subject. We now understand what the role, very ambiguous at first sight, of being for us could have been. To the question of what place it occupies in relation to the in itself and the for itself, it is now possible to answer that the question should have been posed in the opposite direction. Being for us, insofar as it manifests the transcendental constitution of experience, has to situate itself neither in relation to what this experience is for itself, nor in relation to what it is in its truth, in a deeper knowledge, but it is, on the contrary, being for itself which situates itself in the being for us, as the moment when consciousness knows itself neither in the empirical truth nor in its constitution. Being in itself represents the moment when consciousness knows itself in its truth, but has not yet discovered itself in its constitution. There can be being for us only in the consciousness of the transcendental constitution. In these conditions, it is quite normal that being for us is the side by which experience escapes itself, and the side by which it always catches up with itself, rejoining the truth that it was without having the immediate experience of. This we, which we have seen was initially the ideal consciousness of a subject who would have realized the totality of experience, thus ends up revealing itself as being the transcendental subject who constitutes the experience, who but who only appears as such in the phenomenological investigation. A true phenomenology, therefore, cannot be satisfied with a dualism of in itself and for itself, where the in itself would be, to use another vocabulary, like the already constituted horizon of the for itself. It must necessarily manifest this other dimension of experience, which is never thematized as a simple level of experience, but which Hegel calls experience for us. It is something quite similar, if the interpretation of Hegel that we propose is correct, to what Husserl calls transcendental reflection. But here we are following Hegelian phenomenology as a transcendental analysis, at a moment when the first reality almost attained risks once again escaping us. At the moment when the passage from the consciousness of the philosopher to the transcendental subject was about to appear and be founded and be identified by the mediation of historical experience, the totality of the system was about to be justified by its point of arrival, we are again thrown back to the open sea. This point of arrival reveals itself as never being anything other than the expression of a philosophical subjectivity. What must be the foundation of all concrete experience is nothing other than the consciousness of a philosopher who expresses not the effective reality by which he would have come to consciousness, but who projects a universe, only thought, into a reality that does not yet exist. If it is true that absolute knowledge does not yet correspond to any concrete reality, then it must be admitted either that Hegel's system ends on this contradiction of admitting against its own principles of purely subjective happiness, or that the interpretation that we have attempted inflects Hegel's thought not only towards a transcendental philosophy, but also towards a subjectivism against which all Hegelian texts protest. It is this difficulty that must now be examined by engaging what comes out of everything we have already said. We thus risk seeing completely invalidated the hypothesis of a phenomenology of spirit as a transcendental regression towards the principle of all experience. If this principle is indeed the solitary subjectivity of a philosopher, then we fall into a definitive aporia. If, on the contrary, what is still for us only the most limited of subjectivities corresponds to an objective reality which supports it, then this subjectivity, which will have been only a vanishing moment in our research, will be found to be justified. This is why we must now, proceeding in the opposite direction, we thus risk seeing completely invalidated the hypothesis of a we thus risk seeing completely invalidated the hypothesis of a phenomenology of spirit as a transcendental regression towards the principle of all experience. If this principle is indeed the solitary subjectivity of a philosopher, then we will fall into a definitive aporia. If, on the contrary, what is still for us only the most limited subjectivities corresponds to an objective reality which supports it, then the subjectivity, which will have been only a vanishing moment in our research, will be found justified. This is why we must now, proceeding in the opposite direction, seek how this transcendental subject, which is also our philosophical consciousness, can express itself and find itself in a concrete history and reality.